Hello and welcome to the Winning Agenda. My name is Jesse Marshall, and I'm here with an online Jinteki.net match with my new Argus security build, hoping to probably keep this one. So we've got some economy cards here. We've got Quandary to protect HQ early, HQ I should say, and a couple of relevant cards to put in remotes. So all around there's a little bit of action, all the sorts of things we need. As I said in my write-up and in the episode of the Winning Agenda where we discuss this deck, it is very, very important to have money. So having 2 economy operations in our opening hand is good. It would probably be a little bit better if that agenda was a profiteering rather than a gear hands. But then again, profiteering doesn't combo so well with double dedicated response team. So I think we'll protect ourselves from the siphon with the Quandary there and just put the gear hands down naked. Hopefully our opponent isn't in the mood for running remotes on their first turn, which most people aren't, particularly when we've gone up to 9 credits. Wildside's a good sign. Probably means they don't want to be making any runs this turn, particularly on their last click. There we go. So we managed to get out the first agenda, which is always important. Get the train rolling, and it is an agenda that will give us back a little bit over the course of the game in terms of credits, which is also good. The dedicated response teams are going to be nice. I often, with this deck, leave R&D open, and with 3 snares still in the deck, that's not a bad thing to be doing.
Where to next? I'm the king of the world! Ooh, what's that? Now you're talking.
Whiskers helps nurture your
that
cat's
didn't
inquisitive
worry
nature,
anyone.
providing
So
everything they
we'll
need now and at
continue
every
here.
stage of
We've
their
got-
life.
Oh, hopefully that's not going to be a problem. So we've got our opponent has drawn from their wild side and they're gaining a credit. So they're still reasonably low, which is good for us because it should give us... Okay, daily cast is going to give us a bit more time. So we're looking at... this is interesting. If that was... It would be nice now if the Gear Hands was a larger agenda, one of our 2-pointers. But that's okay. We can just... in terms of if it was, we could sort of put the archer out in front of it and be willing to lose our first Gear Hands to upgrade it into a 2-pointer and then look to score some more agendas behind that remote. I do like to try and get an archer set up into a remote reasonably early. It does help with powering out the agendas later on. And in terms of tempo, losing the agenda definitely is outweighed by the tempo that we gain from being able to consistently score behind the archer. Of course, David does thwart sort of archer-based plans to some degree, so archer's not going to stand up on its own forever. We are going to need more ice to go in front of it at some point, but that's what the data ravens and the other pieces of ice are for. So we do manage to get our second 1-pointer here, and just like with the first one, it is going to give us the potential to get some money back with the Gear Hands ability, but it's also going to be something that we can fuel the archer with, which is good. So seeing our opponent just developing their board a bit here. Possibly looking to go for some siphons in the next couple of turns if they can find a Faust and try and really siphon us down. But having the dedicated response teams is also a really, really good foil for siphon if that's what we are going to be seeing. Not only does it let us sink our credits into something when the siphon does come along, but it also, if they are rezzed, obviously makes siphoning much, much worse for our opponent. So this is really nice here. We're on 3 credits, so we can't really afford to res the dedicated response teams, let alone trigger a snare. So it's a bit unfortunate, but our opponent does only have 2 clicks left, and if we can install Profiteering and Beanstalk next turn, and then our opponent continues to run R&D, there's a very, very good chance they're going to hit a snare, and we're going to be able to tap into those dedicated response teams at the same time. Okay. So hoping, weirdly enough, that our opponent doesn't hit a snare this time. Yeah, 2-pointers are not great. So that's a little bit annoying. Losing a 2-pointer always does feel a little bit worse than losing a 1-pointer, but a couple of meat damage coming our opponent's way there anyway. So the upside to resing the dedicated response team before they access is it forces them to take the meat damage, but because our opponent was already on 6 there, it's not really a lot of upside. Data Raven is a good one to draw, and our opponent's probably going to see that coming in front of R&D. So we are in a little bit of danger of Siphon if we put that on R&D, but the fact that we are... no, this is an interesting one. We could install the Profiteering and install the Data Raven, in which case we can res the Data Raven, we can res one of the dedicated response teams, but if we res the Data Raven, we can't res both. Or we can install the Data Raven and gain a credit, but still we wouldn't be able to res both, and we wouldn't be able to trigger Snare and res both dedicated response teams. Or we can install Profiteering and gain a credit, in which case we can score Profiteering and res both dedicated response teams or trigger a Snare. So I think that's probably our best approach this turn, because having the Profiteering scored will get us a lot closer to being able to afford to do everything we want to do with the cards in our hand and the dedicated response teams on the board. All we've got to do is write out one more turn, and the amount of damage that our opponent can really safely do to us in one turn on R&D is not particularly high, particularly when we can afford to res dedicated response teams and trigger snares. So we might see a Siphon come down here. Which, yeah, would be a little bit annoying, but we don't only have 2 cards. Or we might see them next turn. We might see the Siphon next turn, which will be good still, because we will have Profiteering and we'll have money to do everything else on R&D, which will be good. So we'll trigger off this Profiteering. And if our opponent is hoping that they're going to be able to ride out our early scoring pressure, Siphon us down, and then run on R&D, hopefully we can put paid to that idea with a timely res of the response teams here, and then stabilize those servers with these ice next turn. So sure gamble the res. So I mean, this is a pretty slow build up from Valencia, which is good for us. Sometimes it is nice sort of for your opponent to be running a little bit more, but in this particular instance I'm not too upset with having a little bit more time to set up. So we've sort of got a bit of money here. We want to really draw into a bit more action soon. Having agendas in play, progressing our agenda scoring plan every turn is sort of what we really want to be doing. So, or at least having the Scorched Earth to respond when our opponent does eventually run. But it looks like, given the credit lead that we've amassed here, our opponent is going to be a little bit more wary of running. So this turn, next turn, now that we've drawn the fracking, I want to be sort of transitioning into that. So I want to get this server ready to go. We have got our opponent doesn't have enough bad pub now that they can afford to run our response teams and trash them for free, but as long as we stay far enough ahead on the money race, I think they'll be reticent to be making runs. Okay, until they draw a Plascrete. Slightly unfortunate, but at least we can bluff out this fracking as a Shattered Remains. And put it in a reasonably taxing server, to the point where our opponent's going to have to either have David, or, I mean, realistically, if they do want to make a successful run and steal this fracking next turn past the Data Raven, so they've got the David. But still, if they want to steal it past the Data Raven, they're going to have to be willing to break the Data Raven or beat the Trace. Trace is not going to be such a problem for them, actually, so they're going to have to be willing to break the Data Raven, cop the meat damage, and then run and trash those cards, and possibly float a tag. So is that going to be enough for our purposes here? I think probably not. We want to try and probably, drain those David credits. Sorry, those David counters before we go for the fracking score. I don't really want to throw them another 2-pointer. So drawing another agenda there is exactly what we wanted, because now we can turn this, the future is now, into a threat on the board, which is hopefully going to enable us to leverage these response teams, or a threat from our deck if we do end up scoring it, and another point. It seems as though whilst we remain ahead on credits, our opponent is reasonably unwilling to run. But okay, so we've seen the blackmail here. We don't really want to raise these response teams, because forcing 2 meat damage at this point, not a huge deal. I think that's the option that our opponent will choose anyway. And we don't want to give away the information of about those response teams at this point. Yep, so they're taking the 2. So still another couple of blackmails and a couple of same old things left in the deck. So I think in some ways we might be better off just going naked remote plan at this point. Yeah, I don't mind raising the quandary here. I mean, giving away what ISID is for Siphon is sort of irrelevant when our opponent has Faust and David anyway, because they know that they're going to be able to get through anything. So, interesting R&D interface. So, I mean, you can see here also the good thing about taking the bad pub against a Faust deck is it's not costing us a lot. Obviously, it still enables our opponent to trash things if they access them, but they're still having to use their resources to break our ice, which is nice. Okay, so Paper Wall, not a great one against Faust, unfortunately. Second Sea Source, also not great. Sort of want to draw something that we can chuck down in that remote, really. That's not an agenda. Or a Scorched Earth at this point, because we want to... The way that we can try and squeeze them is take them lower than 4 cards and use the tax to kill them. But whilst they're high on credits and high on cards, that's a little bit difficult to do. The other option we have is to try and just exhaust them, but 27 cards is another 13 turns of sitting here doing nothing, which isn't a particularly appealing proposition. The unfortunate thing about this game is that we haven't drawn any snares to combo with our DRTs yet, because as long as there's not I've had worses sitting in that hand, having a snare would actually be very good. So what can we do here? I mean, we can install the Atlas, but I don't really want to put them to 5 points. I think we can afford to, and we're going to cop a blackmail anyway. I mean, the fact that it's just a shell game, the fact that they know that we know that they've got the blackmail and the same old thing just means that, are they going to use it? Are we going to try and bait it out? Would we do the same thing again? The situation you want to really get into with this deck is, if they call your bluff or if they don't call your bluff, it's still a win for you. And I don't feel like installing that Atlas right now and them blackmailing it is a win for us. However, installing this Snare and them blackmailing it is definitely a win for us. So let us at least tax them another card on those dedicated response teams, which are probably going to be resing this turn if they want to get in. Unfortunately, still no Scorched Earths to punish, but if they blackmail, even from the bin, on that Snare, and we res both response teams, that's still a kill if there's no I've had worse in hand. Now this is a toughie. If it's a Snare on top, we'll be a little bit annoyed that we didn't res the response teams. But I don't think we want to give away the response team ploy just yet. I think if they go again, with the number of counters on medium now, there's a reasonable enough chance for us to just res the response team. Particularly seeing as they seem to be getting a little bit sensitive about their cards in hand, which is good for us. Unfortunately, it seems as though what we were discussing last turn in terms of would they assume that we would be willing to put another 2-pointer down in that remote. They don't seem to think that we would have done that. So we probably could have got away with it, but we didn't, so that's okay. The sick plays would be if we could draw another snare and play it down on top of the snare for the old double bluff. Okay. I mean, I think we're in a reasonable position where we can sort of sit back and money up a little here and just hope that we can hit something sweet off these DRTs. Because it is going to be 3 cards for our opponent to be breaking there, if they don't want to give us a trace on the Raven. Look like we're seeing runs this turn. Although Street Peddler accelerating through that deck is not something we mind awfully much. Yeah, probably could have been a little more aggressive on the agendas in terms of installing that Atlas instead of the Snare, but I mean, that's always the way it goes. So another DRT is nice because it means that whenever we do see a run on R&D, we're going to be in a decent position. And now, I mean, installing in the outermost remote your agenda that you don't want them to run is generally not the best idea, but it's just a sort of mixer-upper. People are generally more likely to run the outermost remote, so putting the card you do want them to run there is generally better, so I'll often install the Snare in the outermost, but then sometimes I'll mix it up and put the Snare on the innermost, and this time I've gone with the most common play of putting the card I don't want them to run on the outermost, which is hoping that they're going to assume I'm not doing that, which is probably a little bit too much going down the rabbit hole, but I think it's okay. All right, so we've got a vamp, and before they access here, we can be rezzing the triple response team, which will be a kill unless they have I've had worse. Oh, so they've got Plasgrade, so they can avoid it that way. But I'll assume that our opponent probably won't vamp here, but then, I mean, they could. I'm sort of assuming that they'll just run our dedicated response teams, get rid of them, and then same old thing, the vamp. Which it looks like what they're doing. Unfortunately, our paper wall and ice wall probably won't stand up to too much fast scrutiny. But at least we saved some of our credits there, which is a little bit. We've hopefully given ourselves the window to score the Atlas. It depends on how brazen our opponent's going to be here, in whether they're willing to run back with a vamp with 2 response teams active. I guess we'll see. Also, whether they're willing to pass turn then with a tag as well. Although we don't have the Scorched. We can get your hands and Scorch them once, which at that point would eat up the Plascrete at least, and open back up Sea Source Double Scorch for us later in the game. Okay, so that's good for us. We'll get this Atlas out and we'll get up to 5 points. So we're probably going to see a Vamp next turn, which is quite unfortunate. We did have the response teams to save ourselves for 1 turn, but I don't think they're going to be enough to keep that out forever. Vamps are sort of a little bit worse in a lot of ways than Siphon for us here. One, because it hits such a large number of credits, and we rely on being higher than 10 to be reasonably Siphon proof, because we sort of need, you know, between 6 and 8 credits to be threatening things most of the time. And if you're sitting on 18, you sort of feel, well, I can cop 2 Siphons and still be sitting where I want to. But when they've got Vamp, obviously, it's a little bit worse. Well, I mean, this is pretty good for us because they've at least let us res the Data Raven and use some more of these credits. I'm not really sure why. Maybe they want to save the Blackmail for later. Save the same old thing for the Blackmail for later, but maybe there's another operation in there they think's essential. Deja Vu, perhaps. So we're seeing Parasite on Data Raven. Okay. So our outs here are getting a little bit limited. I mean, we've got hostile takeovers in the deck, which is probably our best out at this point. There's 3 hostiles still in there. Our opponent's giving us ostensibly 4 turns with the Data Raven. We can install the Snare over the Snare and then gear your hands, I should say, which would be okay. The other option is that we can install the Snare, install the Fracking in advance, which I think is probably a weaker play, because our opponent is sort of in the position where they have to run things anyway. So I think installing the Snare and gear handsing here is good because our opponent sort of has to run that, and if we sort of take up a turn of theirs doing the Vamp play now, I mean, that's threatened anyway at any point, and we haven't really lost that much other than, you know, losing this Snare, but we forced our opponent's hand on this turn, so don't mind that. Okay, so they've used the same old thing to play the Blackmail, which is exactly what we want. Because hopefully it means that there's less Vamps going around. We'll go action before access. Oh, we've already resed our response team, so I don't need to worry about that. But we'll use the Snare ability to give a tag and 4 more meat damage from the response teams. And the good thing again here to reiterate is that if our opponent does want to go in and get these response teams, they at least have to pay a card to do it. And we're only investing 1 credit total in making them do that. So I've used up half a Plascrete. A whole Plascrete, okay? Not bad. So that Snare ploy, you know, ate up a whole turn for our opponent. And the same old thing. So we can't really complain about that. Now, the question is, do we want to threaten the Shattered Remains here to get rid of that last Plascrete? I think we're going to struggle to land the tags anyway, given our economic position. So I think I want to go with plan Hostile Takeover. However, our opponent does still have the Vamp plan, so sort of sitting here building up to hostiles is not quite going to get us there because our opponent can just vamp us out after they trash our response teams, and then we go down and our Data Raven dies in a couple of turns, and that's not really looking that great for us. So I think forcing our opponent to continue feeling uncomfortable and make some decisions that they're not happy with is where we want to be. Okay, so we've got another run here, which will let us kill the Plascrete, which is good. Getting the Plascrete out of there at least, give us another win condition, means that those response teams are more threatening. Does a range of things. Plascrete is bad. We don't like Plascrete. Cost us a few credits, cost us a turn to do it, but I think it's probably a good thing. And like we said earlier, we can obviously, our opponent can get those back with the Deja Vu if they want, but then that's another same old thing used. It's some more tempo for them lost while we've still got 5 points here and we're still staring down, hopefully drawing some hostile takeovers at some point. So we're losing this dedicated response team. Finally, our opponent has said that is enough of that rubbish. They can go in the bin. But those couple of small ice that we did put in front of the response teams have done a good job. They've been rezzed for a good 3 or 4 turns now. And we did manage to get off a snare with the response teams that forced a Plascrete use. But unfortunately, they have met an untimely end. So we've got a turn next turn where we can Beanstalk if we want. I mean, I sort of almost want to save the Beanstalk, I guess, because any amount of money less than what our opponent has is really pretty worthless at this point. So I'm happy to just purge, I think, and lose a Sea Source. And the reason I say that any amount of money less than our opponent is worthless is because they can just vamp us now with impunity, now that we've lost our dedicated response teams. So if they are, reasonably wary about running through this Data Raven, which hopefully they will continue to be, it still does give us that chance to draw these hostiles. And we've also wiped the medium now as well, which is good, because that makes it more likely that we will actually draw them. So 3 out of 20 cards left. And we need to draw 2 of them to give ourselves the best chance of winning. I mean, we have had quite a few turns here where a hostile draw would have been pretty big, and we've also drawn out a large number of blackmails. 1, 2, 3, 4, I think. 2 same old things and 2 natural blackmails, or maybe it was 2 same old things and 1 natural blackmail, because the other one was died to damage early on in the game. Nonetheless, I think we've done quite well in losing 1 agenda to 3 blackmails. The others were Shattered Remains and Snare. Really hoping that it's a hedge fund or beanstalk. Good, not a fracking. It would have been quite disastrous for us to lose the fracking there, because it would completely remove our ability to play agendas out into remotes and not worry about losing the game instantly. So we've got 1 snare and quite a few agendas left in the deck, so this is not really what we want to be seeing. We're assuming that our opponent's taking a tag with 1 click remaining. So we'll just double check. Yep, okay. Cool. And they are losing a card. So we've got them down to 8 cards here, which when we said earlier that we were worried about 12 turns, we've managed to work our way through around 6 or 7 of those, I think. Plus the Street Peddler helped us along a bit, and some extra draws along the way. So we can hope that this is a snare. Really, I mean, a snare or agenda here is pretty good. The fact that our opponent's getting a bit desperate and running out of cards is nice. Well, it would have been nice for us to draw that hostile takeover as well, I guess, but what can you do? And they've taken 2 meat damage, remove the tag. Okay. It does for them make running R&D a little bit risky in future turns, I think. We can just Gear Your Hands and hedge fund here. Keeping the beanstalk is important because it allows us to get up off the floor. I mean, Gear Your Hands does allow us to get up the floor a little bit more quickly after a vamp as well. But, you know, we don't really want to lose the Scorched or the Sea Source at this point. So I think losing the hedge fund was okay. Certainly better than any other options we had. Drawing, not really great. Gaining credits naturally, not really great. If we're going to be pitching something anyway, might as well play the hedge fund instead of pitching it, because we haven't lost out there. So our opponent down to 6 cards in their deck. I mean, there is always a question of whether, you know, purging virus counters last turn meant that our opponent was more likely to run, seeing less cards. But then, I mean, they always have the choice with medium of how many they want to access anyway. So I don't think that's really anything to beat ourselves up about. And it was important to keep that Data Raven alive on R&D. That's really important. So we're seeing another run, some of the third last click, or second click. Going down to 3 cards again. So if this is a snare and an agenda, going down to 2 cards this time. So if it's a snare, then it's a kill, which is good. One can only hope. There are 2 2-pointers left in the deck, I guess, which is a bit annoying. There's another Fracking, another Atlas. So those are insta losers for us, but there's also a snare, which is an insta win. An agenda is also not bad at this point. A 1-point agenda. Okay, so it's 1-1-pointer. What does our opponent want to do? They've sort of got to take the tag here. And then remove them both. So you can see now that we're getting a little closer to being able to actually threaten to kill them. In terms of that money gap is closing slightly. But I don't think we're ever going to get up over the top of Katie, naturally. So I think installing this Archer and Gila Hands means that they're only really going to get one more run on R&D, which still gives us drawing the hostiles as an out, as long as they don't hit this turn or when they make their next run, which is asking a little bit of our deck, but I think it's our best out at this point. If that Fracking was an Atlas instead, there's the possibility that it would have been worthwhile installing it in that remote. But I think when we're on 5 points, the situation is that our opponent has to run anything that we put in a remote. So I think they would run the Fracking and they would then win the game. So when that comes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of trying to put your opponent in a situation where whatever they do is bad, putting ourselves in a situation where one thing that they could do, which is probably the most likely thing for them to do, is going to mean they win the game, is not really where we want to be. So installing the 2-pointer in a remote against Valencia is a pretty tough ask. And I think putting pressure on Valencia to run your R&D and kill herself on your snares is the better plan at this point. And then hoping that you can draw those hostiles or draw the snares and lure out that last blackmail, because we've only got those 6 cards remaining for our opponent. Okay, so let's get this archer online. Go to this profiteering. Okay. So we'll gain 2 from the archer on the way past. Our opponent will take a tag. And presumably they'll break. And then presumably they'll break this last ice wall as well. The other option we had was to advance the ice wall on R&D, but I think really we want our opponent to be running there to some extent, because killing them on the snare is just as likely as drawing the hostiles and scoring out at this point. So, although obviously advancing this ice wall in the remote is not the worst idea in the world. It's unfortunate we lost. Yeah, so there you go. What do we have left in R&D? Oh, wrong click. So just the 2 hostiles, a snare, Jackson. So it would have been nice to have those come out a little bit earlier in those middle turns where we had our opponent under pressure, but our opponent did play very well. Got them down to 3 cards in their deck, but unfortunately couldn't quite get there. We ended up sort of relying on plan draw hostiles, or plan exhaust them out of cards, or plan snare, none of which really came off. If we had exhausted them out of a few more cards, we possibly could have relied on working in behind this ice wall in a new remote. So building up that remote and then having the ice wall as blackmail protection, advancing it, and then trying to score this agendas there. But alas, we did not get to that point. So well played to our opponent, and I hope you all enjoyed coming along for the ride. Cheers.